document, and they are just stunned by what we do here. In our small corner of the world, that we're able to pull off the kind of national names in the Chautauqua movement is an impression that they're just in awe of what we were able to accomplish here on campus. So I hope you all enjoy it. It's going to be a wonderful ride. You probably need to buckle your seatbelts. Thank you.
You can see why we're so proud of Dr. Burke. He is a great addition to our state. I thank him too for putting it in perspective, and I really think we should try to be visionary, and I have said that I really believe that what Dorinda and others put together, I'll introduce her in a moment, is for North Idaho College and our state a historical moment to be able to bring all those people together. We've captured on videotape, thanks to Andy Finney and his staff. We have all of this on tape, and it will be cataloged in the library. As the president knows, we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tapes in our library over the last 30 years, both of the Popcorn Forum and the 28 years of the North Idaho College TV program, the PBS program. And we hope that future generations will come and look at those tapes, and those who have contributed now will contribute even to future generations. But I have the same reaction that Dr. Burke did, in the sense that I had both celebration in mind. I also had some solemn thoughts about what happened. And I was so taken on Sunday night when people 100 and a little bit younger walked across the stage. I think of everyone here that our senior citizens appreciate this the most because they lived through this century. And they were very touched, and we were touched with them. Before we introduce the 20 today, I also want to have to come to the microphone to say something to you. Just one of the greatest friends I have. Her and her husband are just incredible assets in this community. He's a Baptist minister, and she is the secretary to a very large division of the fine arts and English and foreign languages. She used to be our secretary in the social sciences, and she moved over to a larger division with additional responsibility. I was so impressed. She told the head of the division that she wouldn't take the job unless she could continue to be executive secretary of the Popcorn Forum. What loyalty. I was totally taken with that. And Dr. Virginia Johnson, who heads that division, has been one of the greatest advocates of this process and is one of our great scholars. Before I introduce her, let me just say about Dr. Johnson and some others like her. Dr. Johnson is now recognized around the United States as a Chautauqua performer. She'll be performing this year in Nevada this summer. She and a number of her colleagues and one of our students were able to go this last October to Chicago and perform at a national convention, humanities convention, and Dr. Burke was there. He came back with lots of smiles on his face, talking to his colleagues around the country. This summer we shall be performing in Wallace, Idaho at their great festival, so it is really spreading. And again, the person who's very critical to this whole process, crucial to it, is Dorinda Moyer, who, as I just introduced something about her, she had the task, among others, of finding the 101 people for this great century walk. And I wanted to share a little with you about that, and then we'll do the 20 for today. Welcome our friend Dorinda Moyer.
Good morning. It has been the greatest honor for me to be able to find these 100 people, and it was a challenge. I've been working on it for several months. Especially some of the older people, of course, but I've gotten to know every senior in the whole county, I think, plus a few others. And I've learned a lot about their personalities, and I've learned a lot about their history. And it has been so exciting. I hope most of you, how many of you were here on Sunday night? So there was a lot of you here to see all 100 people on the stage. And the thing that has impressed me, I think, about this is watching history evolve through this week. And let me recap a few of the things. I know it's gone quickly, but realize in the year 1900 that Eastman Kodak introduced the first camera, cost $1. The little brownie box, some of you may remember that. Then we go on down to 1903. The Wright brothers flew their first airplane, and Henry Ford founded the Ford Motor Company. How many of you own Fords in this audience today? Myself included. Okay. 1903 is when that started. So you are a part of history as well as these others. And of course, then when we think of the Wright brothers and all of the mishaps that they had in getting to the point where their airplane finally flew, and now we see men landing on the moon. So, you know, the course of just 1 century, what has actually transpired and where we are today. And it's been interesting for me. I've been doing some family history going back several generations. I have some great aunts. And they've made my history come alive so that now when I hear of the Civil War, I know that my great-great-grandfather was in that Civil War fighting for my freedom here in America today. And it impresses me. I'm glad I have that kind of a history. And this is what this week is about, is trying to help all Americans grab hold of our history and realize there were people that went before us and struggled. They had catastrophes, they lost their lives for us so that we can stand here today in the 21st century with all of the luxuries that we have, with the freedoms that we have in America. This is 20th century America that we are portraying for you this week so that you can grasp what has gone on before you and grab hold of that fact that we are where we are today because of these people who went before us. Just a few others. Plastic was brought about in 1909. There was something, Henry Ford then brought the first assembly line to America in 1913. Margaret Sanger opened up the first birth control center in America. You'll be able to hear much more about that tomorrow if you come in the morning as you hear Margaret Sanger explain to you all that she had to go through and the ridicule, the humiliation that she endured so that we can have some control in our population. It goes on and on, the world wars that we experienced, World War I, World War II. And then there were the fun things, and I'm so glad that we were able to include some of these as well, our Winnie the Poohs and our Barbies and our Snoopies and those things in our lives that make us smile and make us laugh. And that's part of America too. We're not just an industrial revolutionized country. We have humor, we have it all. And I'm proud to be here representing the 20th century America and sharing with you these 20 people today. Oh, yes, indeed. We do have the Hot Mamas tomorrow. And so if you're making this a weekly, daily kind of an event, you'll be sure to be here early for tomorrow's musical performance, the Hot Mamas. And they're hot. You won't want to miss that. So lots more events coming up, and we'll look forward to seeing you all.
Dorinda, thank you. You articulate so very well what we're all about, what we're doing. One of the footnotes, and then the president and I shall disappear, and Dorinda will introduce to you these wonderful people from 1960 to 1979, and then tomorrow we'll have 1980 through year 2000. We have a little special baby that was born in February. In fact, she was born on Valentine's Day. She'll be with you tomorrow. She's our sweetheart, and someone will speak for her tomorrow. I think her mother will speak for her. If she speaks, you're going to be really saying this is an amazing popcorn for me. But anyway, we are very, very delighted that you're here. And let me say that in the last 4 years, we've had in attendance 19,500 people at all of our different events. I predict that when this week ends, we will break our record of the most in any one year. We'll have the numbers in after Friday. It looks like it's going to be the largest year ever. And we, even at night, have 100 or 120 at a time. So we keep doing it because that, and as I get speakers from around the country, they tell me that they like to come here because they have such huge audiences. They go some places, even some of the Ivy League schools, and have oftentimes a smaller number than we do. And I'm not going to announce the topic, but I had dinner last night with Dr. Clay Jenkinson, and we already have the topic for next year. But I want to tease you a little bit, let you know about it later. Put on your calendar the week of April 1 through 6. It's already set, and we all have all the facilities. With that, thank you so much for coming, and on behalf of Dr. Burke and our Board of Trustees, who's very supportive, and all of our employees and our students, we thank you. And I want to also thank the Idaho Humanities Council for 5 years for help funding this, along with student government and the college. And we're going to perform briefly tonight in front of this Board of Trustees. So Dr. Burke asked me that. Have a great, great day, and here's Dorinda to introduce the next 20 special people.
Okay, today we are going to celebrate those who were born from 1960 to 1979. And we'll begin with Kevin Shute in 1960.
Hi, I am Kevin Shute, born in 1960. Believe it or not, the 60s are turning 40 this year. And in 1960, John F. Kennedy defeated sitting Vice President Richard Nixon for the presidency of the United States, became the youngest president as well as the first Roman Catholic to serve in that office.
Hi, my name is Mike Forswell. I'm very fortunate to actually wrote my name down on here because I can't remember if it hadn't. I was born in 1961. Fidel Castro's rule in Cuba became more communist and the United States broke off diplomatic relations. An American attempt to overthrow Castro's government in the Bay of Pigs invasion ended in disaster. Also, the Berlin Wall was built after Warsaw Pact members requested that East Germany stop the tide of refugees escaping from East to West Berlin.
1962.
Hi, my name is Lisa Clark. I was born in 1962. Pilot John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth, and Sam Walton opened the first Walmart store.
For my husband, that was the best year of the whole life, is Walmart open. 1964. No, did I skip 63? Oh, and that was a big, big year. I bet everyone knows what happened in 1963. 1963.
Hello, my name is Janet Anderson Pless. I was born in 1963. John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd in Dallas, Texas, and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took office. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech at the foot of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. to celebrate the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation.
Hi, my name is Kevin Stouffer. I was born November 27th, 1964, and some of the things that happened that year, besides my parents' joy at my birth, were John, Paul, George, and Ringo made their American television debut on The Ed Sullivan Show, starting Beatlemania. The Civil Rights Bill was passed on July 2nd and called for an end to discrimination. Also, the Surgeon General released a report that linked smoking to lung cancer. However, despite warnings, cigarette smoking increased. The year was 1964.
1965.
My name is Andy Finney, and I was born in 1965. In the news, U.S. troops landed in Vietnam, and in fashion, the miniskirt was introduced by fashion designer Mary Quant.
Begged him to wear a miniskirt, he wouldn't do it. 1966.
Hi, my name is Jeannie Klett. I was born in 1966. In that year, the National Organization for Women, led by feminist Betty Friedan, was formed in an effort to help American women obtain equal rights. Also, Star Trek began airing on NBC.
1967.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Hennage, and I was born in February 1967. In 1967, Thurgood Marshall became the first black Supreme Court justice, but unfortunately, riots were civil rights increased, and it resulted in over 77 people dying and over 4,000 people injured.
(1968)
Good morning. My name is Raelle Anderson, and I was born in 1968. I'm very sorry to say that in that year, civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered by an assassin, setting off riots across America. In addition, Robert Kennedy was assassinated as well, ending his chances of ever becoming president of the United States.
1969.
My name is Dan Geisel. I was born in 1969. Neil Armstrong was the first man to walk on the moon when he exited the lunar capsule Apollo 11 with the famous words, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Meanwhile, here on Earth, hippies were celebrating at Woodstock, and children were introduced to Sesame Street.
Or Big Bird. 1970.
I'm Charlene Allen. I graced the world with my presence in 1970. The EPA was created by Congress to control air and water pollution, which made it easier for 126 runners to run around Central Park 4 times, launching the first New York Marathon.
1971.
Hi, I'm Michelle Ludy, and I was born in 1971. The 26th Amendment lowered the United States voting age from 21 to 18, and soft contact lenses received FDA approval.
1972.
My name is Dawn Geisel, and I was born in September of 1972. In that year, the Watergate scandal began when 5 men were arrested in the new Democratic National Headquarters, which eventually ruined Nixon's presidency. Also, Nike was founded and became the world's largest sneaker company.
1973.
My name is Scott Jergens. I was born in 1973. In Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court ruled that women have the unrestricted right to an abortion. Also in 73, the last U.S. troops leave Vietnam.
1974.
My name is Nikki Mulvaney. I was born in 1974. President Nixon signed an act limiting highway speeds to 55 miles per hour, which successfully conserved fuel after OPEC raised oil prices. But it didn't slow down the Watergate scandal, which resulted in the first resignation of a president in American history.
1975.
My name is Brian Seguin, and I was born in 1975. And in that year, Microsoft was founded by Paul Allen, age 22, and Bill Gates, age 19, who was a Harvard dropout. Yes.
That means for any of you dropouts, there's still hope. 1976.
Good morning. I'm James Estes, and I'm representing 1976. In 1976, America celebrated its 200th birthday. Also, 1776, in July 4th, the Continental Congress signed the Declaration of Independence.
1977.
My name is Monica Smith, and I was born in 1977. This is the year that Elvis first died. And Star Wars revolutionized the world of special effects in movies and went on to break all box office records.
1978.
Hi, my name is Carrie McKee, and in 1978, the first test tube baby, Louise Brown, was born in London to mom Leslie Brown.
And 1979.
Hi, my name is Kimberly Smetana, and in 1979, an accident at 3 Mile Island nuclear plant increased the fear of nuclear meltdown, and the first Sony Walkman was introduced.
for all 20 people in these 2 decades, representing the end of the baby boomers and the beginning of the busters.
College and Whitworth College. This weekend, she will be performing at the NIC Foundation Concert. She is frequently a featured soloist and will be performing today for us a cycle of American songs. She is accompanied by George Conrad.
would deny. Come all you fair tender ladies, this warning here of all young men, like glowing stars above, they brightly shine, they brightly shine, and fade Go away from my window, go away from my door. Oh, please go from this heart of mine and trouble me no more, and trouble me no more. I sent you back your letters, I sent you back your ring. You sent me back this broken heart, though it's a worthless thing, though it's a worthless thing. I'm going to the river, I'm going to the sea, I'm going to throw this heart away. It's no more use to me. It's no more use to me. Go away from my window, go away from my door. Oh, please go from this heart of mine and trouble me no more, and trouble me no more. Go away from my window, go away from my door, and trouble me no more, no more, no more, no I know where I'm going, and I know who's gone with me. I know who I love, and I wish 'twere he I'd marry. Feather beds are soft, and paneled rooms are bonny, but none can make me glad like my handsome, winsome Johnny. I'll have stockings of silk, shoes of fine grain leather, combs to buckle my hair, and a hat with high plume feather. And all of these are fine, yes, all are fair and bonny, but none can make me glad like my handsome, winsome Johnny. I know where I'm going, and I know who's going in the meadow, there's a poor little Annie. Butterflies round its eyes, poor thing crying for its mammy. Hush-a-bye, don't you cry, go to sleepy little baby. Hush-a-bye, don't you cry, go to sleepy little baby. When you waken, you shall see them, all the pretty little horses, blacks and hays, dapples and grays, coach and eight with whom a dancing. Hush-a-bye, don't you cry, go to sleepy little baby. Go to sleep, go to
Catherine Damiano and George Conrad.
Good morning. I'd like to add my welcome to those you've already had to the third day of our 30th Annual Popcorn Forum Convocation Symposium. This year we're dealing, as you know, with a journey through 20th century America. I'm Virginia Johnson. I am chair here on campus of the Division of Fine Arts, Communication, Humanities, Foreign Languages, and English. In another life, I am also a Chautauqua performer. I appear as Mary Wollstonecraft, who is probably best known as the mother of Mary Shelley, but whom I'm trying to make better known as an 18th century writer and feminist. Today, as you know, we are focusing on the arts in 20th century America, and we will have two presenters this morning, followed this afternoon by two panels that are at the same time. So I want to have you take that horrible choice of which panel you'll be attending. Panel number one is upstairs in the Edminster Student Union in the Lake Coeur d'Alene room, and panel number two, also at 1 o'clock this afternoon, is here in the auditorium. Our first speaker this morning is Dr. Clay Jenkinson, whom you may have seen yesterday performing as Dr. Robert Oppenheimer. Today he is going to speak to us about a historical perspective of 20th century America. You will note in the program, where you can read more about him, that Dr. Jenkinson is a scholar. He is indeed a Rhodes Scholar, but he is also a scholar in every sense of the word. Having looked in the dictionary, since I'm an English teacher, to see what the word scholar denotes, first of all, a scholar is a learned person. And with a PhD in literature and as professor of ancient studies at the University of Nevada in Reno, Clay Jenkinson shows us that side of his scholarly self. Second, a scholar is a specialist in some particular branch of learning, and Clay's specialty is Renaissance literature. But we know that Clay is a real specialist in Chautauqua performances. He himself has so far developed 6 Chautauqua characters. He is probably best known as Thomas Jefferson, a character whom he has presented thousands of times, including to the President of the United States. So he's a fairly awesome person to be on the stage with. I know, I've been there. He has also developed John Wesley Powell, whom he performed for us, Meriwether Lewis, Jonathan Swift, Sir Francis Bacon, and of course Robert Oppenheimer. Further, he is also the mentor to hundreds of other Chautauqua performers, among them his own private following here, those of us who perform at North Idaho College. Third and finally, a scholar is a student. I would say that Clay Jenkinson is a model of a lifelong learner who is open to all kinds of experiences, learning, knowledge, and who also applies that learning to his own life and to the lives of everyone whom he meets. I'd like you to please join me in welcoming Dr. Clay Jenkinson.
Night of December 31st would be on a butte on a little hill in western North Dakota, so I decided to do it. Well, if you know North Dakota, you know that it's an Arctic climate, and the average annual temperature is 42 degrees. And that includes a relatively hot summer. So December 31st is usually a cold day in North Dakota. And my mother, who still lives in the house I grew up in, begged me not to do this. So I bought the most expensive sleeping bag in human history and assured her that my body would be easily found on top of this butte and showed her on the map where to go with the four-wheel drive and so on. And so then I did it, and it turned out not to be December 31st for accidental reasons, but January 4th, and I spent that night on this lonely butte, and it was the coldest night in human history. It got dark at 3, and it was my New Year's celebration. I had a bottle of champagne. I need not tell you, I was alone here. No other human being would have joined me. And the wind was howling at about 40 miles per hour, and it was 17 degrees below zero in absolute terms, so it was about 80 below with the wind chill. And so at about 8:30 p.m., I couldn't think of anything to do except sleep. I had a bit of the champagne, and I thought a little bit of, and I read a few passages from Henry David Thoreau's book Walden, which is my favorite book. But then I thought about this century a little bit, and about the millennium, and about the next century, and this began a series of meditations, which is continuing at this moment. But let me just say a few things about this. If I were writing an open letter to my daughter, I would say this: that the key fact of the 20th century was that we stepped up to the nuclear precipice in 1945. And the United States, Thomas Jefferson's nation, dropped not one but 2 atomic bombs on Japan. That's the key fact of the 20th century, I think. And the second fact is directly related, and it's in a sense the most remarkable fact of the 20th century, that since then, since August 9th, 1945, the atomic device has not been used again in battle. So that is truly remarkable. First, that we did it, and second, that we backed away, because there is no other weapon in human history that has been developed with such potency, with such capacity to give one nation power over another, that has not been used. And so those are very important facts. But what I would also say to my child is that her century, the 21st century, is going to be much less safe than the 20th. Because in some perverse sense, the fact of the Cold War, that there was a Soviet bloc of nations and a Western bloc of nations, and then a few semi-independent ones clinging to either of these 2 great blocs, that fact encouraged nuclear restraint. But in the world, the post-Cold War world, those restraining mechanisms of the superpowers are not any longer in place. And it's not at all clear that nuclear weapons can be restrained in the 21st century in the same way that they were in the second half of the 20th. There will be rogue states that will have this capacity. And the United States has not developed a client empire relationship with these rogue states that will enable us to force them to behave. And our moral authority is somewhat weak for 2 reasons. First of all, we are the only nation that has used the atomic device in war, and secondly, we refuse to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so the America's credibility as a nation pushing for restraint is decidedly weakened as we enter the next century. That's number one. And number 2 is, if the atomic bomb and the fusion device are interesting, just wait, because human ingenuity is almost certainly going to produce weapons of even more extraordinary violence in my daughter's century. So it's sobering to think of the 20th century, the bloodiest century in human history. Now, it's not that humans are more bloodthirsty than they used to be. Arguably, we are less bloodthirsty than we once were. But our violence, our technology of death dealing, the technologies of violence are greatly increased in their efficiency. And so human bloodthirstiness has expressed itself more globally in the 20th century than it ever has before. And that can only increase. So that's sobering. But of course, there's lots of good news. Life for the haves, and I take virtually everyone in this auditorium to be one of the haves. Life for the haves has never been better, and it's only going to increase in its dignity and comfort in the next century. The beginning of the century, think of the Titanic. When the Titanic goes down, there's virtually nothing that can be done for it. If that disaster occurred today, there would be rescue because of the communications devices and the fast helicopters and transport systems that we have. Polio has been eradicated, virtually eradicated in this century. Smallpox has been eradicated. At the beginning of the century, the idea of a kidney transplant would have been thought of as a miracle. Today, it's routine. So many things that were thought unthinkable in 1900 have proved to be the case by the second half of the 20th century, and we're just entering a kind of warm-up period on these miracles. Remember, those of you who are born in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s remember when the pocket calculator first appeared. And for about $180 you could buy a device that could add and subtract. And it was so morally offensive to math teachers that it was banned from high schools throughout the United States. And now for 75 cents you can buy a device that's infinitely more powerful than that one that cost $200 and caused so much ruckus. If Thomas Jefferson could be dropped into this room and could see one of you answer a cell phone, he would have absolutely no way of understanding what that meant. I mean, think of it. We've fallen asleep to the miracles of our technology. You can be sitting in this room, and with a device that's not connected to anything else, you can talk to somebody in Paris. How could any person of the 18th century begin to make sense of what we take for granted to the point of just absorbing routinely, day by day? Take the internet. My daughter will not only grow up in a world that is absolutely wired, there will be no fact that she ever wants that she cannot instantaneously have. She won't have to go to a computer and log on. She'll go to her wristwatch and log on. She'll be permanently on. She will be permanently on, without question. And the keyboard will disappear before she's in college. The keyboard will absolutely disappear, except for advanced editing purposes. Voice recognition software is now such that she will simply write her term papers while walking, and they will be edited on the spot, and if she needs to check a fact about what year Francis Bacon or Shakespeare died, she will simply ask her watch and it will contact a satellite site and pull that information down and incorporate it. This will all be done instantaneously, effortlessly. There is no fact, there is no matrix of information, there is no body of knowledge that she won't have access to. I remember when I went to college, my father, this was 1973, my father gave me, as a graduation gift, a portable typewriter, Hermes 3000, a beautiful little machine. And I thought I had died and gone to heaven. And I wrote most of what I have ever written with that portable typewriter. And now that typewriter would be sneered at by any college student in America. I saw on an airline, I spend a lot of time on airlines, I saw in a flight magazine the other day a kind of a typewriter, a classic portable typewriter being offered as a kind of nostalgia piece. You could buy it to put on a coffee table and show people that there was a time in world history when people had to hit something in order to write. Just think of what has changed and what things have been swept away, just even in the past decade, and what will be swept away. And so, for the haves, for the people of privilege, for the Americans, for the white Americans, for the people who are in the first world, the problem of civilization has been essentially solved. I was thinking of the Beatles to come in another 30 minutes. The Beatles song, A Day in the Life. Let's look at a day in the life of an average privileged American in the year 2000. She gets up in the morning. She takes a shower. The water is there. It's hot. It's clean. That wouldn't have been the case in 1900. She goes into the kitchen. There is a loaf of bread that somebody else baked. That wouldn't have been the case for my grandmother. It has been sliced. I remember when sliced bread was seen as a kind of breakthrough. She'll put it in a toaster that is computerized. I saw one the other day at a department store, computerized so that you can micro toast whatever you please. Shades of nuance in toasting. Maybe toast the left side more than the right side. Toast the front a little more than the back. It's true. Computerized toasters. If that's not a sign of the utter frivolity of Western civilization, what could be? So she will toast her toast. She knows that bread is safe. She knows the jam that she puts on the bread is safe. She finishes this, she goes back and brushes her teeth. Her teeth are going to be, they're virtually now decay-free. But by the time my daughter is an adult, there will be no decay, because there will be a shellac of some sort that can be sprayed on your mouth that will fight off any evil thing. And even if her tooth should decay for some reason, it will have been replaced by some extraordinary synthetic. And so then she will go to the car. The car will be in the garage. Garage door will open. She won't have to push a button. It will sense that she's ready to leave. She will back out. The garage will seal itself again. The car will be absolutely sealed. There will be a computer. There will be a workstation. There will be anything that she wants in that vehicle. There virtually are now. And that car will never break down. When I was growing up in North Dakota, cars routinely broke down. That was part of owning a car. You were never sure you were going to get anywhere with a car. The older people in the room will remember this, that a trip was a risk. If you even drove to Lewiston, that was a risk that you took, and you might not make it. But today, the cars that are now being produced, thanks to globalization of the economy, thanks essentially to German and Japanese competition, the cars are being produced virtually never break down. So she will drive from her comfort, climate-controlled house in her comfort, climate-controlled vehicle, wired all the way, to her climate-controlled office, where she will do no physical labor. She'll never have to lift a bale, never have to milk a cow. The workplace will be infinitely better tuned to human comfort. We will have solved the problem of carpal tunnel syndrome. All these problems will have been solved by computerization. At the end of the day, she will drive to the grocery store, where she probably won't have to get out of a car. But if she does, it will be much less obnoxious now than having to walk that 70-foot space from the parking lot into the store. There she'll get her perfectly safe food and go home and get on the internet and write a note to her grandmother, who may live in North Dakota, who may live in Paris, who may live on the moon. And then she will watch a personally selected, possibly personally edited television program. So when she chooses Ken Burns' Civil War, she'll say, I want Ken Burns' Civil War in the North Dakota phase. And then it'll just come down just the way she wants it. And then she'll go to sleep and start the next day. And it sounds, in a sense, like paradise, because if you ask my grandmother, who grew up in Minnesota, she would say we weren't certain where our food would come from. We weren't certain that it was safe. We weren't certain of our health. We weren't certain of our vehicles. We weren't certain of the economy. We weren't certain of communications. And if you tell my grandmother the number of things that, if she made a list of the number of things she was not certain about, it would be huge. And yet we're certain about all of these things, and we're only going to get more so if we're the haves. And so we're facing a time when it will really be said that the essential macrobiotic problems of life have been solved for the privileged of the world. And that's delightful. Because in Thomas Jefferson's time, if you had a sore throat, you might die. And my mother, who grew up in the mid-20th century, had polio as a child and nearly died. And so these are breakthroughs that nobody could be contemptuous of. Nobody. So this is good news. But here are the 4 caveats that I would give to my daughter about the problems of life being solved. Number 1, the gap between the have-nots and the haves is wide and growing. And what we're going to see, my daughter is going to be one of the mandarins. She's going to be one of the elites. Not because I'm her father, but because she was born in America. She's going to be one of the elites, and she is going to be educated, and she's going to be skilled, and she's going to be in that upper echelon of the 21st century, but there are going to be literally hundreds of millions of people across a gulf who have not somehow been brought into that equation. And the have-nots are going to be less cheerful in the 21st century than they were in the 20th, for several reasons. First of all, the world is so tightly wired that they're going to see too much. They're going to see how the haves live, and they're going to demand it for themselves. So, that's number 2, that the have-nots are going to be less manageable in the 21st century. Number 3, this miracle that I'm talking about, essentially epitomized by the digital toaster, This miracle has come at an enormous cost to the earth, to the environment. And it's not quite clear whether there can be a counterweight of reclamation and recovery. In other words, it's not quite clear that this can be done without enormous environmental costs. But the cost of this civilization has been the grizzly bear. There are now fewer than 100 in the lower 48 states. And the cost of this civilization has been the salmon. The salmon has virtually disappeared from western waters. And the cost of this civilization can be measured in more aesthetic, but still important ways. If you go camping in the wildest place in America, and you're out there feeling a kind of Daniel Boone virtue, you will hear a jet engine going overhead, and there will be noise interruption. The industrial world will remind you, not on purpose, but will remind you that it's the dominant system and that you are fooling yourself in some regard. And so the cost of this miracle has been just gigantic to have-nots and to the earth itself. And it is not at all clear that the first world, that our world, has either the will or the way to do this with less manipulation of the environment and less damage to the underclasses. That's the big question for the 21st century. And finally, this is harder to talk about, but I think it's important that we talk about it. The cost to the human spirit for this miracle has been just gigantic. It seems to me that there is a very deep and very widespread anxiety in America about what we lost, what has been lost. And I want to tell you this great story that will give you precisely an image of what we have lost. This is my favorite single story. It's about my grandmother. My grandmother died at 92 in Fergus Falls, Minnesota. She was the most remarkable person I've ever met, and yet she only had a 6th grade education. She and my grandfather were dairy farmers. They had a small dairy farm in Minnesota, 112 acres. And on that they had some wheat and some corn and some rye and some oats and a pasture. And they lived on that as Jeffersonian Americans for 40 years. During that time, during the time that they were milking cows, the 40 years that they milked cows, my grandparents never left the farm for more than 8 hours, not once. Because if you leave the farm, the animals don't get milked. And my grandfather had a theory that nobody else could milk as sensitively as he could, which seemed odd to me, but it mattered to him. That was his sense of mastery. And my grandmother had baked bread twice a week from the time she was 7 years old until the time of her death. And during the Depression, which was a very severe one because it was not only an economic depression but an environmental one in the Midwest, my grandparents never borrowed a dime, not once. And they used to eke out a living. They were essentially subsistence at this point, eating their own food. But they would add a little cash to their income by, my grandmother would make cottage cheese on the top of the stove. My mother, who is 68, will not eat cottage cheese because she remembers the smell of cottage cheese curing on the stove. My grandparents were sort of ideal patriots. They paid their taxes on time. They never broke a law. They never asked for anything. They would have scorned welfare. They would have scorned food stamps. They even scorned Social Security. And my grandfather died when he was in his late 70s. My grandmother lived into her 90s, and when she was a widow, she became one of those amazing people who is old enough to be able to say whatever's on her mind. And she grew into a whole new phase. Somehow, television had an effect because I would go see her, and she'd, I don't know if you remember, if you're old enough, you remember Tom Snyder, the first of the wild talk show hosts. And she would say, I was watching Tom Snyder the other night, and he had on these gays, you know. And I would just look across at her and think, how did the word gay ever come out of your mouth? I mean, it was just such an awakening that she'd be talking about transvestites while baking bread, you know. It's true. I mean, television piped into people's homes a world of stimulations that they never would have had otherwise. You know, where would you ever encounter this? In Fergus Falls, Minnesota. But television brought it in. And if you think television was interesting, that's when Tom Snyder was the only show in town. Imagine now, if she were on the internet, what she'd be talking about at breakfast, you know. The internet is an amazing thing because it's creating new communities. I don't mean to sound irreverent or frivolous, but if you wanted to create a chat group for, say, Chippewa women divorced with diabetes, you could do it. You could create on the internet a network of people with like interests. This couldn't have been done in 1970. You can now decide what it is that you want to be or talk about or identify with, and if you throw out a kind of trial balloon on the internet, there will be responses in a community. You might feel like you're the loneliest person in the world, the only diabetic Navajo woman in Idaho. But if you throw out your net on the internet, suddenly there's a community of 100,000 of you spread around the world, and now this gives you a sense of identity and confidence, and it makes you feel like you're part of a community. You're not marginal anymore. And so this is one of the oldest dreams of mankind. Virginia Johnson introduced me as a Renaissance literature scholar. I was just reading the autobiography of Montaigne, the first essayist, French essayist, the other day, and Montaigne is writing about his father in an essay called The Best Father That Ever Was. He said, "My father had a dream that there would be a place in every town where you could post what you wanted. If you wanted to buy a hog, you could post that. If you wanted to travel to Rome and you wanted a traveling companion, you could post that. If you wanted to sell cloth in exchange for scarves, you could post this, and people would come together and they would examine these postings and they would respond to each other's needs." Well, he was essentially describing the internet. This was 1520. And since then, the technologies have wired us so that this is finally possible. And it's a miracle. It's a miracle that's taken loneliness and a sense of isolation and marginality out of millions of people's lives. Well, at any rate, back to my grandmother. So she sort of came alive to this wider world in her 80s. And I used to learn from her. Most of what I know about life I learned from her. And one time I went to see her, and we had the same ritual every night. After supper, everything occurred in the kitchen. After supper, she would do the dishes, and we would talk or play a game. And then she would watch the 10 o'clock news. And right after the weather, she wouldn't even wait till 10:30, but at 10:18, after the weather, she'd snap off the television and go to bed. Invariable ritual. So we're sitting there in the 2 or 3 minutes of conversation before she goes to bed. And she said, she's 85 now, and she said, "If I were 5 years younger, I would buy a fruit dryer." And I thought, well, if you were 80, you would buy a fruit dryer, but because you're 85, you won't. So the next day I went out and bought her a dehydrator. It was one of those splendid dehydrators, a Ronco product, about 8 stacks high, with a small V8 motor at the bottom. And I brought this home to her gleaming in white plastic, and then for about 2 years she dehydrated everything she could get her hands on. She would take a beautiful Oregon peach and shrink it to a chip. She would jerk chicken, she'd jerk salmon, she'd jerk beef, she'd jerk pork. She made fruit roll-ups. There wasn't anything that she wouldn't desiccate just for the fun of it. So she went through a kind of fruit dryer phase. But her real genius was for canning. If you can imagine her basement. This is a tiny little farmhouse in rural Minnesota. It's one of those farmhouses that has been added on to a couple of times. The basement, therefore, is about a quarter the size of the whole house. And it consists of nothing but cinder blocks. And it has an old-fashioned washer and an old-fashioned dryer. And my grandfather had built shelves out of pine, huge shelves. And on them were literally, I'm not exaggerating, literally hundreds and maybe even thousands of mason jars filled with preserves, rhubarb and beets and peaches and pears and you name it, everything. This gorgeous pastel landscape in the basement of these jars that she had carefully preserved. And in the middle of the room, a one little 40-watt light bulb. You can picture this scene. You all probably have a connection to this scene somewhere. And so I was there a few years later when she was about 87 years old, a few years before her death, and we had watched the news. And as we were going to bed, I said, Grandma, would you teach me how to make cucumber pickles? And she said, no. She said, if you'd asked a few years ago, I would have, but I don't have a garden anymore. Now, she had literally, this is true, she had literally had a garden from the time she was 10 years old until she couldn't crawl through it anymore. She had severe osteoporosis, but even when she could even just crawl, she still kept one. But when she couldn't crawl, she quit. So now she said, you're out of luck. No garden. So I went to bed, thinking of lost chances. The following morning at 5, she's knocking on my door. And she said, get up. Mrs. Mingy has cucumbers. So I dragged my body out of bed. She served me homemade toast and orange juice, and we got in the car at about 6. Drove across town near a little lake, near Battle Lake, and there was Mrs. Mingy's house, and she had the most beautiful cucumbers you've ever seen. But of course, you can't just get the cucumbers. This is Minnesota, so you have to spend hours earning the right to get the cucumbers. You have to have coffee, and you have to have coffee cake, and you have to see photographic albums, and I'm rather impatient, but my grandmother is giving me the look, you know. So about 9:30, we escape with the cucumbers. We're on our way back. A giant sense of expectation, and my grandmother said to me, you know, you're going to have to buy your own jars. Now I thought, you're 87 years old. You've got about 800,000 jars in the basement. I know you're prolific, but you're not going to fill those jars. She made me buy my own jars. She made me buy my own seals. She made me buy my own lids. She made me buy alum, which apparently stiffens the errant cucumber. And she made me buy dill, and she made me buy onion, and so on and so forth. And so this is now becoming an expensive little hobby. So we go back out to the farm with all this apparatus, and we set up shop. And for the whole day, from about 10 o'clock until about 4, I preserved cucumbers. She taught me how to scrub them. She taught me how to cut the nibs off of them. She taught me that you can't use city water. It has to be well water because city water is tainted with chemicals. And she taught me how to pack the cucumbers. And when you think you've packed the jar full, you're only beginning. Now you really need to pack, you know. And if you put the dill here and don't put the dill there. And then when you're all finished, when you've got them, then you put the seals on and you screw the lids on and you put them in the vat of boiling water and you listen. Because at a certain point, the vacuum will pop. When it pops, you know you have a preserved jar. But if it doesn't pop, you have to take it apart and start over and so on. Well, by the end of the day, my hair is just stringy. I'm exhausted. I'm sorry I ever brought it up. She's been sitting serenely, bossing me around for 5 or 6 hours, taking telephone calls from Mrs. Vincent, you know. So by the time the day is over, it's the dusk of the afternoon in Minnesota, and there are 20 beautiful jars of cucumber pickles on the counter. And I was mighty proud. And she looked up at me and she said, you know, I want to commend you. You've done a good job here. And she said this. She said, why don't you take a jar? This is a true story. I called my mother. She went to bat for me. I got 3 jars. I gave one to my mother. I gave one to my sister. I still have mine. I look at it from time to time. My sister opened hers and said they were the worst pickles she had ever eaten. I don't trust that as an objective evaluation. But this is what I'm talking about. The beginning of the century, that was America. And I'll bet every one of you in this room who is more than 30 years old remembers that America. And some of you still have a link to it. That America is gone, going, it's going to disappear. It's going to have pockets. This might be one of them. But that America has disappeared in 1 century, and what is following is more efficient and more wired and more productive and more cool, but is in fundamental ways less connected and less rooted and less communitarian and less familial and less spiritual and less Jeffersonian. So here's the question. Here's what I would say to my daughter. Here would be my one piece of advice for my daughter. Be an amphibian. She needs to live in both universes. She needs to live in the high-tech universe and be absolutely wired as well as any human being could be wired. She needs to master those skills, because that's how you're going to succeed. If you have mastered those skills in the next century, you will be in the Mandarin class and life will be handed to you on a platter. At the same time, to counteract the deep soul depression of this civilization, and I think it is just so widespread, you can see it on almost every face you meet. She needs to live in my grandmother's world too. Now, how is she going to do that? How are we going to live in your Jeep Grand Cherokee K-Car Limited hermetically sealed vehicle by day and with your cucumber pickles by night? I don't know. But it seems to me that if she lacks either one of those, if she's either a throwback to my grandmother's world, but it's not wired, she will fail in the 21st century. But worse, if she is totally wired and is as successful as America can create success, but lacks the rootedness of my grandmother, she will fail in a much deeper way. And so the synthesis is what we need. A place like Coeur d'Alene attracts new residents for this very reason. People are coming here thinking that they can be wired and have a pine tree too. And so Coeur d'Alene is going to grow, and Aspen is going to grow, and Bozeman is going to grow, and a whole range of places are going to grow. But you all know that as Coeur d'Alene attracts the very kind of people you would most want to attract in some sense, people who are yearning for something deeper in American life, the quality of life in Coeur d'Alene is going to deteriorate after a certain point. The only place where this still has a chance is North Dakota. No one wants to go there. And so North Dakota is the most dearly acquired taste in America. If you come there, you can have a township for what it costs to build a house in Coeur d'Alene. No one's going to come. But this is going to be a big issue. People desiring to reconnect, but when they reconnect, they're going to reconnect in high-tech, consumerist ways, and they're going to forget the very thing that they thought they were going to gain. And so I want my child to be an amphibian, if she can work it out. There's a great book that I would recommend on this subject by Joseph Sachs called Mountains Without Handrails. I'm going to give her this book when she's 11 or 12 years old and ready to read, or maybe 14, whenever the moment comes. But I'm going to give her this book. It's by Joseph Sachs, Mountains Without Handrails, and here's what he argues. He argues that if you go fishing with a net, that's not as interesting as going fishing with a line. And if you go hunting with a semi-automatic rifle, that's not as interesting as going hunting with a bow. That the dignity of the things that matter in life increases as you limit your technological superiority over them. And so if you wanted to, for example, spend a night on a butte in western North Dakota at the Millennium, and you took a helicopter there, where there was a Winnebago that had been dropped into place, with a generator and a satellite for television, that would not be the best use of that moment. And yet that's precisely what most of us are going to do. So we need voluntarily to limit our technological mastery in order to recover our spirit. And Joseph Sachs in the book Mountains Without Handrails says that our national parks need gently to lead us back to a simpler way of apprehending nature. So when we go hunting, we need to limit our technological superiority. So when we go hiking, so when we go fishing, so when we go, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to give her that book, the argument of which there is dignity in self-restraint of technology. That doesn't mean you don't get online at the end of the day, but it means that somehow you need to incorporate pickles into your world. I think that's a piece of wisdom that's being lost in this culture. Well, let me move on quickly. This is a great age to be a woman. My daughter is so lucky to be born in 1994 because her mother is a lawyer. And there will be several female presidents in her lifetime. She might be one of them. There will be a whole range of female justices of the Supreme Court. That barriers that women simply had to put up with. Any woman who's 40 years or older in this room has put up with levels of patriarchal prejudice that she should never have had to put up with. But my daughter will encounter almost none of that, thanks to the revolution that's occurred. Gary Wills has said that women's lives have changed more in the last century than in the last millennium. And they're only going to get better. I mean, now, this is not a political statement, but women in the early 21st century are going to have absolute control over their reproductive systems, and there won't be a law, a technology in the world that can prevent that. And so we are moving to a time when there will be absolute female ownership of reproduction, and that is going to have, whether you like it or not, that is going to have revolutionary impact on civilization. It already has, and it's only going to get more so. And so the world of womanhood is going to be a very different world for her than for my grandmother, than for my mother, and than for her mother. Now, some of this is good and some of this is bad. I won't go into that, but this revolution has brought a lot of dislocation with it. But nevertheless, her chances of doing what it is she wishes in life, unimpeded by tradition, have risen almost to 100%. And that's great news for her as a human being and an individual and a woman. But it's also a problem, and here's how. The miracle of women's equality, white women's equality, has cast into stark relief the failure of equality for blacks, for Native Americans, for the poor. And so the fact that white women have been the beneficiary of affirmative action and social engineering to the point that they have gone from being essentially legally subordinate creatures in 1900 to being fully equal creatures in the year 2000 is great news for white women of a certain income. But it's terrible news for African Americans, and it's terrible news for Indians, because those cultures have languished. The same engineering has not worked. It hasn't admittedly been attempted with much zeal, but the same engineering has not worked for those communities. And that's going to, one of two things is now going to be the case. Either civilization is going to decide, I'm not talking about the truth, I'm just talking about perception here. Either civilization is going to decide that black people, for example, have been given a fair chance to raise themselves up to the level of equality and have failed, and therefore deserve to fail, or we're going to conclude that this problem is so deeply rooted in our culture that a Manhattan-style emergency project to restore race dignity and to create race healing is going to be required before we can solve this problem. The point I'm making is that if all minority groups were languishing, it wouldn't put any single group into relief. But the fact that white women have done so brilliantly well under social engineering plans puts the minorities who are languishing into stark relief. And so do Asians. The success of Asian Americans is a way of putting Hispanics, blacks, Native Americans into stark relief. And so there is a propensity to judge. We all feel it. I know I do. There's a propensity to judge when you see an Asian family coming from Cambodia, and within one generation they own a city block in Los Angeles. You think, there's what gumption can do. And then you look at the African American family that's languishing, and you think, why didn't it work for you? And to be educated is to resist judgment. but none of us can do it. And so this is bad news for race relations. And the 21st century is going to be about one of two things, either race struggle or cultural emergency labor to ease race struggle. But complacency is not going to be an adequate response to the race problems of this country in the 21st century. That's hard news, and it's going to get more difficult. And it's going to have implications for Coeur d'Alene. You've already had white flight from elsewhere, and you're going to get a lot more of it. That's going to be a fact of 21st century life. White flight from urban madness. So that's a stark view. Well, let me conclude here, and maybe there's time for a quick question. My daughter's world is going to be a world of open possibilities. And she faces freedoms that no American, and indeed no American woman, has ever faced. And I think her life is going to be just brilliantly successful, structurally, without any help from her parents. But there are going to be these moments where the eternal facts of human life intrude. You can have a toaster that can provide the best toasted bagel imaginable. But there will still be jealousy, and there will still be doubt, and there will still be angst, and there will still be bigotry, and there will still be hesitation and diffidence and fear and terror. Those are eternal verities in human culture. If you look at all cultures, some parts of the human condition do not change. In the 18th century, the age of Jefferson, thought that the human condition would change, and it simply doesn't. The 20th century is just a vast reminder that it really doesn't change at all. And so, no matter how hermetically sealed we can make my daughter's life, and how many facts we can bring in via the World Wide Web, and how well she can stay in touch with her mother no matter where she's traveling on Earth, and how well her heart can be repaired if it breaks down for one reason or another, she is still going to face the moments that every one of us in this room faces when your soul is in trouble. And there is so far, not even with Prozac, there is so far no chemication that can deal with the human condition. And so that means several things. Number one, she's going to have a life of the Spirit. Now, how she chooses to spend that capital on Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Native American spirituality, Buddhism, who knows? But what we have discovered at the end of the 20th century is that the secular, humanist, technological, consumer paradigm that we've been living in now since Francis Bacon and Thomas Jefferson, that paradigm produces concrete miracles, but it doesn't do a great deal for the human spirit. And so there's going to need to be some kind of a new avenue for spirituality. It'll be interesting. I'm very eager to watch how she spends her spiritual capital in her life. She has more choices now than anyone ever had. When I was growing up in North Dakota, you were not going to be a Buddhist. That would lead to some ridicule. Today it would not, and that's a miracle, I think. But secondly, and here's the last great plea I want to make. What makes Robert Oppenheimer an interesting human being, what makes Thomas Jefferson an interesting human being, is that they had the humanities. The humanities are the great tradition. Plato, Milton, Emily Dickinson, Dante, Montesquieu, Mark Twain, the tradition of cultural expression, disciplined cultural expression from all cultures, from Black Elk's Spirit Vision in South Dakota in the 1870s to John Milton's Paradise Lost in the 1670s. But disciplined cultural expression that you can only come to terms with by mastery, by immersion. In my view, we cannot succeed as a culture, as a civilization, or as individuals without it. And when the moment comes, as it has in my life, and I know it has in most of yours, when you are desolate of answers, It's either spirituality or the humanities which come in to do the recovery work. And this is the issue that really troubles me more than any other, because as we enter this brave new world, we are largely doing it, we're sleepwalking our way into the technological era. And it seems to me that we're doing it unthinkingly, and that we're jettisoning as we go Shakespeare. It's no longer necessary to read Shakespeare because you can get online and pull down beautiful images from Hamlet. And it's no longer necessary to come to terms with Picasso because you can instantaneously print gorgeous reproductions of Picasso on your high-tech printer. And so our access to the great tradition has eroded just dramatically in the last 20 years, and it's going to erode much, much more in the next 20. And I believe this much. I'll make a wild, absolute statement. If my child masters one of the great traditions, and I don't care whether it's Buddhist literature or Native American song, if she masters one of the great traditions, and I use the word mastery with great emphasis, she will be infinitely better able to get through life than the person who hasn't. And that's, how many times have you heard that in the last 10 years? I haven't heard it once. We have, as a civilization, we have essentially allowed ourselves to believe that we can live without the great traditions. And I say we do so at our peril. So my advice to my daughter is my advice to every young person in this room, and indeed my advice to people as old as myself. We need to wire ourselves right to the nth degree, but we need to find time every day, every week, even every hour to slow down long enough to have a genuine apprehension of something that is more disciplined, more rooted, more communitarian than the thing that we are producing with such breathtaking addiction. Thank you. We have time for two questions.
You were talking earlier about the management of the have-nots. And,
yes.
In the 20th century especially, the U.S. has exploited the so-called have-nots around the world, and in order to maintain our way of life, such as our fuel consumption and our need to take oil from from Saudi Arabia. Now, it breeds a lot of dissent among people in the non-Western world, and how do you see that in our relations globally, as well as how we exploit the have-nots within our own borders?
The question is, what's the relationship between America and the have-nots elsewhere? I've talked a little bit about the haves and the have-nots. What about our exploitation of the have-nots elsewhere? Well, it seems I'm more interested in our exploitation of our own have-nots. I mean, how far are we from the Nez Perce as we sit here today? It seems to me that the fact that there are second and third world nations embedded in a first world nation right here in the United States is enough for us to worry about. But I do agree that one of the biggest issues of the next century is going to be borders. The have-nots know that we have, and they want it, and they're either going to get it, they're going to get it in one of three ways. Either they're going to develop their own countries essentially along American lines, which is a problematic solution to their problems, or they're going to come here to get what we have. Well, that's illegal immigration, sometimes legal, sometimes illegal, or they're going to wage war against us. And so all those solutions look bad to me. So the problem is that we know too much. When my grandmother was born, she didn't know what was going on in Thailand. She had no idea what was happening in Rwanda. But today we know everything. We choose to ignore most of it, but we're in a position to know all that we need to know. I could, if I wanted, know where this shirt was made, where this tie was made, where my boots were made. And if I did, I wouldn't like the fact that I'm wearing them, I'm certain. So we know too much to be as complacent as we are, and the people who don't have are going to be grumpy about this, and they're going to come and get it. And I see I don't see the world coming up to American standards. I see two things. I see America having to fight border and resource wars around the world, usually by proxy, and I see the rest of the world sort of increasingly hostile to American ideals because there's such a fundamental gap between our ideals and the behavior that we manifest in the world's arena. So I don't think it's going to be a good century for the United States, and frankly, I think the standard of living for the 270 million Americans is going to drop a little bit in the next century, although it's going to rise exponentially for the really privileged Americans. Last question, Tony?
Yes, one more question. One has one? Anyone?